The first thing I noticed was the smoke. Thick, black plumes rising from my backyard, twisting into the sky like a signal fire. My stomach dropped. I ran, heart pounding, my boots slamming against the pavement as I sprinted through my side gate. My greenhouse, my pride and joy, was in flames. The glass panels had shattered, the heat warping the metal frame. The tomato vines I'd spent months cultivating were curling into ash, my peppers and herbs nothing but charred remains. The fire crackled, devouring everything. And standing there, arms crossed, was Veronica Talbot, the HOA president. "I told you," she said, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction, "illegal crops are not permitted in this neighborhood." I couldn't speak, couldn't process. My greenhouse was gone. The fire department wasn't even here, which meant she hadn't called them. "What the hell did you do?" I finally managed, my voice shaking with rage. Veronica scoffed. "We gave you warnings, Benjamin. You refused to comply. The HOA board voted and we took action." "Warnings? What warnings?" The only thing I had ever received were petty complaints about my unsightly structure or unauthorized gardening. Nothing about illegal crops. I took a step closer, fists clenched. "You burned my property." "We disposed of an illegal operation," Veronica corrected, tilting her chin up. "Your little greenhouse was obviously a front for something suspicious." "What were you growing in there, Benjamin? Marijuana? Something worse?" I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity. "Are you insane? I was growing tomatoes and peppers, you lunatic." She waved a hand dismissively. "That's what they all say." I wanted to scream. Instead, I took out my phone and started recording the wreckage. The melted remnants of my irrigation system, the blackened soil, the destroyed plants. Then I turned the camera on Veronica. "You just committed arson," I said. My voice steady despite the fury boiling inside me. Her smirk faltered for just a second. Then she scoffed. "The HOA has authority over landscaping violations." I took a deep breath, forcing myself not to lunge at her. "You don't have authority to destroy my property. And you sure as hell don't have the authority to commit a felony." Her expression flickered just for a moment, just enough to tell me she hadn't considered that angle. But then, she straightened her blouse and smiled condescendingly. "Take it up with the board," she said before turning on her heel and walking away. I watched her go, my hands shaking with rage. She thought she had won, thought she had the last word. She had no idea I had the power to evict the entire HOA. The heat still clung to the air as I stood in my backyard, staring at the wreckage of my greenhouse. My jaw tightened, my fists clenched. Veronica and her power-hungry HOA had gone too far this time. Destroying my property under the guise of enforcement wasn't just an overreach, it was a crime. I turned on my heel and strode toward my house, my mind already racing through my next steps. The first thing I did was call the fire department. When they arrived, I made sure they documented everything before the embers had even cooled. The firefighters exchanged glances as they inspected the damage, clearly recognizing that this wasn't an accident. One of them, a no-nonsense guy with steel-gray hair and a weary expression, took down my statement. I recounted everything, from the bogus HOA complaints to Veronica standing there, practically gloating over the destruction. His pen scratched against his notepad, his frown deepening with every word. "This is arson," he said, finally closing his notebook. "You need to file a police report." That was exactly what I planned to do. But first, I had another call to make. I scrolled through my contacts and dialed the number for my lawyer, Jacob Mercer. We'd been friends since college, and he specialized in property law. If anyone could help me bury the HOA in legal trouble, it was him. When he picked up, I didn't bother with pleasantries. I laid everything out: the destruction of my greenhouse, Veronica's baseless claim that I was growing something illegal, and the HOA's blatant abuse of power. Jacob's tone turned razor sharp. "They committed a felony, Ben. This isn't some fine you can dispute. We're talking criminal charges." "That's what I was hoping to hear," I said. "I want to go after them with everything I've got." "You will," he assured me. "But we need to be smart. I'll start drafting a lawsuit. In the meantime, file that police report. The more official documentation we have, the better." I hung up and immediately drove to the police station. The officer at the front desk barely looked up when I walked in, but when I explained why I was there, her expression changed. She waved over a detective, who led me to a small, windowless office. Detective Harris listened intently as I laid out the situation. His face remained unreadable, but when I showed him the video of Veronica standing in my yard, casually admitting to the destruction, His eyes darkened. They really thought they could get away with this? He muttered, shaking his head. You're pressing charges? Absolutely. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. Good, because this is going to be a mess for them. The HOA doesn't have the legal authority to destroy personal property. And the fact that they didn't even try to involve law enforcement beforehand? That's going to work against them. I exhaled slowly, the first real sense of relief washing over me. Finally, someone with actual authority was taking this seriously. Harris assured me that they'd open an investigation immediately. He made copies of my video and the fire department's report, then promised to follow up soon. As I left the station, I could already picture Veronica's expression when she found out the police were involved. She thought she was untouchable, that her little kingdom of HOA tyranny would protect her. She was about to learn otherwise. But I wasn't done yet. Back at home, I pulled out the thick folder of HOA bylaws and legal documents I had kept since moving in. Most people ignored this stuff, but I had always been wary of the HOA's overreach. I had read through every clause, every loophole, every ugly little power grab they had hidden in the fine print. And that's when I found it. A clause buried deep in the bylaws. One that most people would skim over without a second thought. If an HOA board engaged in illegal activity, the community had the right to vote for an immediate dissolution of leadership. Veronica and her cronies had just given me all the ammunition I needed. It was time to evict the entire HOA. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. The police report had been filed, the fire department had documented everything, and Jacob was already working on the lawsuit. But I wasn't just going to sit back and wait for the legal system to slowly grind its way to justice. Veronica and her little band of HOA tyrants had ruled this neighborhood like a dictatorship for too long. It was time to take back what was ours. I grabbed my laptop and opened the HOA bylaws again, scrolling back to the clause I had found the night before. It was written in dense legal jargon, but the meaning was clear. If the HOA board engaged in illegal activity, the homeowners had the right to vote for their immediate removal. The key phrase was illegal activity. Thanks to Veronica's reckless arrogance, I had undeniable proof of exactly that. The first step was getting the community on my side. I wasn't naive. I knew plenty of people were afraid of rocking the boat. The HOA thrived on intimidation, using ridiculous fines and vague threats to keep people in line. But with the right push, I could show them that Veronica wasn't invincible. I printed out copies of the bylaw section and drafted a petition for a special homeowners meeting. I needed a majority of signatures to force a vote, and I had a feeling more people would be willing to sign than Veronica expected. Before heading out, I forwarded everything to Jacob, asking him to review it and ensure I wasn't missing any legal loopholes that the HOA could exploit. His response was quick and to the point. This is solid. Go for it. I started with my closest neighbors, the ones I knew were already fed up with the HOA's antics. The first door I knocked on belonged to the Martinez family. Carlos Martinez answered, still in his work uniform, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Ben? Everything okay? I handed him the petition and the printed bylaw. Veronica and the HOA burned down my greenhouse yesterday. His eyes widened. You're kidding. They claimed I was growing something illegal. No proof, no warning, just torched it. And I have it all on video. Carlos let out a sharp breath, looking over the document. That's insane. But what can we do? We can remove them. The bylaws allow for it if the board engages in illegal activity. I just need enough signatures to force a vote. He didn't hesitate. I'm in. As he signed, his wife, Maria, appeared behind him, glancing at the petition. Finally, she muttered. I've had enough of them harassing us over our front yard. Carlos handed the clipboard back. Tell me who else we need to talk to. I'll help spread the word. With the Martinezes on board, I moved to the next house, then the next. As the hours passed, I realized something. People weren't just angry. They were waiting for someone to stand up first. At the Petersons' house, Linda Peterson practically snatched the clipboard from my hands. That woman fined me $300 for having a non-approved patio chair. It was a gift from my mother. I'd love to see her gone. At the Johnsons', Greg Johnson leaned against his doorframe, shaking his head as he read the petition. She threatened to tow my truck last month because she didn't like where I parked it. I wasn't even violating any rules. One by one, the neighborhood rallied. By the time the sun started dipping below the rooftops, I had more than enough signatures to force the meeting. That evening, I emailed the HOA board attaching the signed petition and a formal request for a special homeowners meeting. By the bylaws, they had no choice but to schedule it. The response came faster than I expected. A terse email from Veronica herself, informing me that the meeting would take place in 72 hours at the community center. I could almost picture her reading my email, her perfectly manicured nails clenching around her phone. She thought she could control the narrative, but she had already lost the one thing she relied on: fear. For the next 3 days, I didn't stop. I made sure every homeowner knew about the meeting. I handed out flyers, posted in the neighborhood Facebook group, and made sure nobody had an excuse to miss it. By the time the meeting day arrived, the community center was packed wall to wall with homeowners. I stood at the front, petition in hand, as Veronica and the rest of the HOA board took their seats behind a long table. She wore a carefully composed expression, but I could see the tension in her posture. She knew she was in trouble. She cleared her throat and addressed the room. This meeting was called under questionable circumstances. I stepped forward, cutting her off. No, it wasn't. It was called in accordance with HOA bylaws, which you violated when you committed arson on my property. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Veronica's carefully crafted mask of control slipped for just a moment before she forced a tight smile. "That's an outrageous accusation," she said. "The HOA acted within its rights to enforce community standards." I pulled out my phone and played the video of her standing in my yard, casually admitting to destroying my greenhouse. The room went silent. Then someone in the crowd spoke up. "That's arson." Another voice. "She can't get away with that." Veronica's face paled. "This is being taken out of context." I held up the petition. "It doesn't matter how you spin it. The homeowners have the right to remove the board for illegal activity. We have the signatures. We have the votes. And we're done being bullied." The tension in the room turned electric. Homeowners started shouting their grievances, years of pent-up frustration boiling over. Greg Johnson stepped forward. "I vote to remove the entire board." Carlos Martinez raised his hand. "Seconded." The vote happened right then and there. One by one, hands shot into the air. The result was undeniable. Veronica stood, her face twisted in disbelief. "You can't do this." But she was wrong. We just had. As she stormed out, her reign of terror officially over, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The HOA was ours again. And the first thing we did? We abolished every ridiculous rule they had put in place. Justice had never tasted so sweet. Veronica's departure from the community center was anything but graceful. She stormed out, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, her carefully composed expression cracking under the weight of her humiliation. The rest of the HOA board trailed after her, some trying to maintain their dignity, others looking like they wanted to disappear entirely. The moment the door swung shut behind them, the room erupted. Conversations overlapped, neighbors animatedly discussing what had just happened. The energy was electric, a mixture of triumph and disbelief. People who had been too afraid to speak out before now voiced their frustrations freely, their grievances pouring out like a dam had finally burst. Carlos Martinez turned to me, shaking his head. "I knew they were bad, but this? Burning down your property? That's a whole new level." Linda Peterson crossed her arms, her face still flushed from the confrontation. "We need to make sure they don't try to weasel their way back in. Just because we voted them out doesn't mean they'll go quietly." She had a point. Veronica wasn't the type to accept defeat. If she thought there was even the slightest chance of regaining control, she'd fight tooth and nail to get it. Greg Johnson leaned against the nearest chair, frowning. "So what's next? We can't just leave things the way they are. We need a new board, and we need to make sure it's not filled with people like them." That was the next challenge. Removing the corrupt board was one thing, but now we had to rebuild from the ground up. I stepped to the front of the room again, raising my hands to get everyone's attention. Took a moment, but eventually the chatter died down. "We did what we had to do tonight," I began, making sure to meet as many eyes as I could. "But Greg's right. We can't leave things in chaos. If we don't act fast, Veronica will try to worm her way back in. We need to elect a new board, and we need to do it now." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. People were nodding, some already exchanging glances as they considered who might be up for the job. Carlos glanced at me pointedly. "You should run, Ben. You started this whole thing, and you actually care about the community." Several others chimed in, echoing his sentiment. I hadn't considered it before, but as I looked around at the hopeful, determined faces in the room, I realized I didn't have much of a choice. If I didn't step up, someone else could, and there was no guarantee they'd do the job right. I exhaled slowly and nodded. "All right, I'll run. But we need an entire board, not just me. Who else is willing to step up?" Hands started going up. Linda Peterson volunteered, as did Greg Johnson and a few others who had been vocal against the previous regime. Within minutes, we had assembled a full list of candidates. We held an impromptu vote right then and there, keeping it simple. The results were unanimous. The moment it was official, I felt the weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders. The HOA had been a tool of oppression for too long. Now it was in our hands to turn it into something that actually served the people living here. Carlos clapped me on the back. "Guess you're in charge now." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Not in charge. Just making sure no one else abuses the power." The meeting wrapped up shortly after, with everyone agreeing to meet again in a few days to start drafting new policies. We needed to undo the damage Veronica and her cronies had done, eliminate the ridiculous rules they had enforced for years, and put safeguards in place to prevent another power grab. As the last few homeowners filed out, I lingered near the door, exchanging a few final words with Greg and Linda. Just as I was about to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A text from Jacob. "Veronica's already making moves. She's trying to challenge the vote. Meet me first thing in the morning." I sighed, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Of course she wasn't going to go quietly, but if she thought she could undo what we had accomplished tonight, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The fight wasn't over yet, but this time I wasn't alone. The morning air was crisp as I pulled into the parking lot of Jacob Mercer's office. I hadn't even stepped out of my truck before I spotted him waiting by the entrance, arms crossed, his expression tight with focus. "Let me guess," I said as I approached. "Veronica's throwing a tantrum?" Jacob pushed open the door and motioned me inside. "Oh, it's more than that. She's trying to claim the vote was invalid." I followed him into his office, where a stack of legal documents already sat waiting on his desk. He grabbed the top sheet and slid it toward me. It was a formal complaint, filed just hours ago, alleging that the special meeting had been improperly conducted and that the board's removal wasn't legally binding. I scanned the document, my jaw tightening. "She's really trying to fight this?" Jacob nodded as he took a seat. "She's banking on people not knowing their rights. She thinks if she complicates things enough, she can scare the neighborhood into submission again. But she's got a problem." I leaned back in my chair. "Let me guess she's wrong." Jacob tapped a finger against the complaint. "Dead wrong. The bylaws are crystal clear. The meeting was legal, the vote was legal, and the board's removal was final. She has no case." That should have been reassuring, but I knew Veronica well enough by now to realize she wasn't going to give up just because the law wasn't on her side. She'd find another angle, another way to claw back control. "So what's her next move?" I asked. Jacob sighed, rubbing his temples. "She might try to drag this into civil court, hoping to delay the transition long enough to regain influence. Or she could start rallying her supporters in the neighborhood to dispute the new board's legitimacy." I exhaled slowly. "Then we don't give her the chance." Jacob grinned. "Exactly. We move forward as if this complaint doesn't exist. You and the new board need to start making decisions, implementing changes, and showing the community that there's no going back." My phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting the conversation. I glanced down and saw Greg Johnson's name on the screen. I picked up immediately. "We've got a problem," Greg said without preamble. "Veronica's been going door to door, telling people the vote was illegal. She's trying to convince them to reinstate the old board." I gritted my teeth. "Of course she is. She's got a small group of supporters already," Greg continued. "Most people aren't buying it, but she's persistent." Jacob raised an eyebrow as I put the call on speaker. "We need to get ahead of this," I said. "Call a community meeting for tomorrow night. We'll lay everything out, what she's trying to do and why it won't work." Greg agreed and hung up. Jacob leaned forward. You need to be prepared for her to show up and cause a scene. I nodded. Let her. As long as we have the facts, she can't manipulate the situation. The next evening, the community center was packed once again. Neighbors filled the rows of chairs, some chatting quietly, others watching the door, waiting for Veronica to make her entrance. I stood at the front of the room alongside the newly elected board members. As I stepped forward to speak, the door swung open, and there she was. Veronica strode in, head held high, her usual air of confidence firmly in place. A few of her remaining supporters followed close behind, their expressions ranging from defiant to uncertain. I didn't give her a chance to speak first. I know some of you have been told that the vote to remove the previous HOA board wasn't valid. I began, my voice steady. That's not true. The bylaws are clear and we followed every procedure correctly. This transition is permanent. Veronica folded her arms and scoffed. That's your interpretation. Jacob, who had joined us for the meeting, stepped forward. No, it's the legal interpretation. I've reviewed the bylaws extensively. There is no loophole, no technicality. The old board is officially removed. A murmur spread through the crowd. Veronica's confident mask slipped for just a second before she recovered. You can say whatever you want, she said, forcing a smile. But the fact remains, this community needs structure. Without proper leadership, things will fall apart. I gestured to the new board members standing beside me. That's exactly why we're here, to provide leadership that actually serves the homeowners, not controls them. Greg stepped forward. And let's not forget why this happened in the first place. Veronica and her board abused their power. They burned down Ben's greenhouse. They issued fines for ridiculous reasons. They enforced rules that benefited themselves while punishing the rest of us. That's why we voted them out. A woman in the crowd stood. So what happens now? What's the plan moving forward? I smiled. Transparency. We're eliminating unnecessary fines, revising the rules to be fair and reasonable, and ensuring that no one uses the HOA to serve their own interests again. Veronica let out a short, bitter laugh. You think you can run this place without structure? You'll regret this when the neighborhood starts falling apart. Linda Peterson stood, her voice firm. The only thing that was falling apart was our patience with your leadership. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Veronica's face darkened. She turned to her supporters. You don't have to accept this. We can fight it. But her words didn't have the impact she was hoping for. The people she had counted on were looking around, seeing how few of them remained. The tide had turned, and she was losing control. A man near the back of the room spoke up. Maybe it's time to move on, Veronica. Her jaw tightened. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched out of the community center, her supporters hesitating for just a moment before following her. The moment the door closed behind her, the room broke into applause. Jacob clapped me on the back. That's it. She's finished. Greg grinned. And now we get to rebuild this place the right way. As I looked around at the relieved and hopeful faces of my neighbors, I knew he was right. The fight was over. And for the first time in years, this neighborhood finally belonged to the people who actually lived in it. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Without Veronica and her cronies dictating every aspect of our lives, there was a noticeable shift. People started relaxing. The tension that had once hung over the community like a storm cloud had lifted. Instead of hushed complaints about ridiculous fines and arbitrary rules, neighbors openly discussed improvements, sharing ideas about how we could make the HOA work for everyone instead of against them. The new board wasted no time implementing change. The first official move was an immediate audit of the HOA's finances. We needed to see where all the money had been going under Veronica's leadership. It didn't take long before we found exactly what we suspected: misuse of funds, excessive administrative costs, and payments that had no clear purpose. Jacob had warned me that uncovering this kind of financial mismanagement was likely, but seeing the numbers in black and white was infuriating. Thousands of dollars had been spent on consulting fees paid to companies that didn't seem to exist. HOA funds had covered luxury dinners at high-end restaurants, suspicious maintenance costs for properties owned by board members, and even legal fees for disputes that should have never escalated. Greg and Linda were just as outraged as I was. We gathered the full report, organized the evidence, and presented it to the homeowners in a special meeting. The reaction was immediate. People were furious. Many had suspected corruption, but now they had undeniable proof. Carlos didn't hold back. He stood up, gripping the report in his hands. So while they were fining us for things like leaving trash cans out too long, they were dining on steak dinners with our money? Linda nodded. It's all here. They drained our reserve funds, spent excessively on nonsense, and left us with barely enough to cover actual community maintenance. The room buzzed with outrage. People flipped through the pages, shaking their heads, muttering under their breaths. Greg stepped forward. The good news is, now that we control the HOA, we can take legal action. We're filing an official complaint with the state's Homeowners Association Oversight Committee. This isn't just mismanagement, it's fraud. The anger in the room turned into determination. Nobody wanted to let this slide. Veronica hadn't just controlled the neighborhood, she had stolen from it. Over the next few days, Jacob helped us compile everything into an airtight case. We filed the necessary paperwork, and soon state investigators were involved. Veronica and her former board members were about to face real consequences. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued to improve. Without the HOA enforcing ridiculous aesthetic standards, homeowners started personalizing their properties. Yards became more vibrant, gardens flourished, and the oppressive uniformity that Veronica had insisted upon started to fade. One afternoon, as I was repairing what was left of my greenhouse, Carlos walked over, his hands in his pockets. He watched for a moment before speaking. You know, this place actually looks like a neighborhood again, he said. Not some magazine cover that nobody wants to live in. I nodded, tightening a bolt on the frame. People are finally making their homes their own. He smirked. And no one's setting anything on fire. It was the first time I could joke about it without feeling a surge of anger. The scars on the ground where the greenhouse had burned still remained. But soon, they'd be covered with fresh soil, new plants, and the knowledge that Veronica and her board would never have the power to do something like that again. A few days later, the final nail in Veronica's coffin arrived. Jacob called me early in the morning, his voice brimming with satisfaction. They're pressing charges, he said. Fraud, embezzlement, and criminal property destruction. Veronica and the former treasurer are the primary targets. I let out a slow breath, absorbing the news. So they're actually going to face real consequences? Oh, more than that, Jacob said. They're looking at full restitution. Every dollar they stole from the HOA has to be repaid. And Veronica, specifically, she's looking at potential jail time. That evening, we called another community meeting, this time for a celebration. The news spread fast, and by the time we gathered at the community center, the atmosphere was electric. People brought food, drinks, and an overwhelming sense of relief. Greg stood at the front of the room, a wide grin on his face. For the first time in years, we don't have to live in fear of our own HOA. Applause erupted. Carlos raised a glass. To no more fines for nonsense, Linda chimed in. And no more stolen money. As I looked around at the smiling faces of my neighbors, I knew we had done more than just remove a corrupt board. We had taken back our community. This wasn't just a victory, it was a new beginning. And as for Veronica, well, the last thing I heard, she had sold her house and left town. She'd ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist, thinking she was untouchable. But in the end, she learned the hard way: when you push people too far, they push back.